Hi, I'm Gary Ralph, and I'm recording a lecture for History 156, American Sexualities. Mostly I'm going to be talking about prostitution in this lecture, although I'm going to be bringing in some other issues because even something like prostitution doesn't exist all by itself in history, and I think it's interesting to see what some of the connections are. First, I should point out that prostitution has existed pretty much all throughout Western history, at least. Not only because women were deprived of the opportunity to make money doing other things, but also because there's always been a market for prostitution. Men seem to be willing to pay for sex either when they can't get it any other way or in addition to the sex that they are getting in other ways. In the United States, however, there was a particular development in the 19th century, the 1800s, that I think is worth looking at separately. Before the 1800s, in America and in England, where a lot of the colonists came from who settled in the English part of North America, prostitution had taken place, but it had taken place in a way that was kind of separated from society. There were women who were what we would call street walkers who, walked around soliciting customers on the street, but they generally did it only in specific areas of town. They were not permitted to go all over the town soliciting customers in what we would call nice neighborhoods. Other prostitutes did their business in buildings or structures that were specifically meant for such things. The term that we would usually use in the English language is brothel. And these were not located right downtown. They were not they didn't put out signs advertising what they were. So you had to know what this building was in order to go there and partake of its services. And you usually found out by word of mouth, friends who would go there, or, somebody would say, oh, that's a house of prostitution over there, and you should never go there. And of course, somebody might say, oh, well, in that case, now I know, now I know where to go. In the 19th century, in the 1800s, the nature of prostitution changed in some ways, and that had a lot to do with the Industrial Revolution that I've talked about. Before the 1800s, in the colonial British part of North America and in the early United States, most people lived on farms. The United States was very largely an agricultural nation. That's how most people made their money. And because prostitutes tend to need an urban environment to work in. I'm not saying there are no prostitutes out in the country, but in order to be able to make their services known and available, they have to live in places where there's a concentration of population. And up until the 1830s, cities in the United States were not large. Most people lived on farms, and they engaged in what is known as a family economy. In other words, the place of each member of the family in that farm was as a producer and economic contributor. And women's place in the family economy was sometimes significant. Women might run the dairy, milk the cows and make cheese and butter. They might be in charge of the vegetable garden, and they might, in fact, sell some of their surplus on a local basis. But the idea was that these activities were always subsidiary to the activities of the man. The person who was in charge of this economic unit of the family was the man. And the idea was that the woman shouldn't be in a position to make enough money to live independently. The work that she was doing was only work that helped the man out. The problem with this is that one of the things that happens in the Industrial Revolution is that the family economy breaks down. You no longer have a family unit in which everybody's contribution is sort of put into the pot, and all of the contributions of the various members of the family are relevant to each other. After the Industrial Revolution, the man in the family might go off to work in a factory. There was no way a woman could help out, maybe pack a lunch, I guess, but the contribution of the woman was no longer contained within an economic unit where her contribution was relative to the contributions of other people. And also, of course, it would happen even in colonial times that a woman might be widowed, or her husband might run off to have adventures, or, just because he didn't want to have a family anymore. And it would be difficult for women to make their way, even as individuals, and would certainly be difficult for women to earn enough money by doing what women did and were allowed to do to support a family. But in colonial times, it was just one of the bad things about being a widow. It was sort of taken for granted that if your husband died or left, you would be impoverished and there would be nothing you could do about it. Sometimes if your husband died, you could carry on the husband's business, and the work of the business would be done by men whom you would hire, but the woman would be the kind of executive supervisor. But that depended on your having married a guy who had a business that could be conducted by somebody else after his death. Women were not economically self-sufficient, and they were not independent in that way. Therefore, what happens as a result of the Industrial Revolution is that when women become single, either because they lose their husbands or because they never had husbands in the first place, but they've got to earn their living and they can't do it on a farm, or for various, perhaps they can't find a job on the farm, but in any case, if they go to the city, they can find jobs doing things, but those jobs do not pay the kind of money that men would make doing the kinds of jobs that were open for men to earn a living at. And very often, the women who are living in the cities after the Industrial Revolution simply can't find employment that will enable them to support themselves, because the kinds of jobs that would enable them to support themselves are reserved to men. Some of the jobs that women do are jobs that are only available from time to time. There was something called the putting out system, where manufactories or establishments that would run by men, there were tasks that they could give to a woman to do at home. Knitting and sewing and spinning thread and weaving cloth and things like that. But it was not considered important to provide these women with an amount of pay that could support them. Also, the hiring of such women to do these tasks depended on what the men needed. If a man needed to have some cloth woven, he would make it known that a woman could come and pick up the thread to make the cloth with. But if he didn't need to have any cloth made, that woman was out of luck. She would not have a job. So not only was the pay for women low, but it was not always steady. It was kind of seasonal, perhaps you might say. And this was something that most men had no problem with, because they didn't think it was important for women to be able to support themselves. In fact, they didn't like the idea that women would be able to support themselves. Their idea was that women were not really fully functioning human beings. Therefore, the really important jobs should be given to men, because men were the ones who had the brains to do it. And certainly it was okay for women to do the kind of jobs that would help out a man in his profession. But the standard situation, men felt, should be one in which women were dependent on men. Either the work that women did helped out men's work, or the women would be supported by the men. And practically speaking, this didn't always turn out this way. So you have a situation, especially in the cities in the 19th century, where single women are literally not able to make enough money to support themselves. And they have to rely on, the charity of friends and things like that. So when we see women turning to prostitution in the 19th century, it certainly had always been the case in history that women were not usually able to be financially independent, and they often turned to prostitution as a means of doing that. But in the 19th century in the United States, there were specific reasons that resulted from the Industrial Revolution that forced women, you might say, to become prostitutes. But there was also the fact that although being a prostitute is not a nice life, it's a nicer life, for instance, than doing piecework for some employer who doesn't pay you enough to live on, or working in a factory where you still don't earn enough to live on and the circumstances are unpleasant. A lot of women turn to prostitution simply because it offers them a better, more comfortable life. I don't think any of them are kind of rubbing their hands together and saying, "Oh, joy, this is my opportunity to be a prostitute." But the social condemnation of women who became prostitutes was based sort of on the idea that any woman who became a prostitute was morally evil, bad. And this fit in with the preconception that a lot of men had that women were really not morally dependable. They needed men to keep them out of trouble and to protect them. And if you had a woman alone in the big city, she would be likely to become a prostitute because women just don't have the moral integrity to keep themselves together. The fact that women didn't have the economic ability to keep themselves together was not something that men were inclined to prefer. Now, one of the things that happens as the cities in the United States grow larger is that the geographic distinctions between one part of a city and another become difficult to keep track of. Back in the colonial times, you had a few cities, even in colonial times, places like Philadelphia, and the different kinds of people, you might say the different classes of people, the working people versus the middle class people, the tradesmen and artisans, versus the rich people, all lived in distinctly different parts of town. Sometimes the parts were not separate from each other, but they were not easy to confuse. One of the things, for instance, that you see in Philadelphia, anybody who looks at a map of Philadelphia today will see that there are some main streets in a kind of grid pattern. And it's sometimes referred to as a gridiron because there was a tool used in the 19th century that had divisions like the divisions on my shirt, for that matter. And the wealthy people lived on the big streets, and the not so wealthy people, the working class, lived in the little alleyways that went from one big street to another big street. So even though there were working people distributed throughout the city, they were not living in places that you could have mistaken for a place where a rich person lived. Also, working class people and middle class people and high class people all dressed very differently, and they had different ways of behaving on the street, so you could tell them apart that way. As we move into the 19th century, though, those geographic differences begin to break down. There's really no way you can keep a working class person out of an area that rich people think of as being their own. The reason that working class people had stayed out of those areas was not because they were being physically prevented from doing so, but because they thought it was not proper or appropriate for them to go into these areas. This is the same thing that was happening in the United States South before the actual enactment of segregation laws in the 1890s and afterwards. Before that time, there were areas where you would not see black people, but the reason that black people did not go there was not because they were legally prevented from going there, but because they knew they would not be welcome, and that it was not supposed to be a place where black people would go. Now, after the end of slavery and after the Civil War, white people no longer had the kind of control over black people that they had before. And this is when they begin to get anxious about the idea that laws should be passed in order to force black people to behave the way white people thought they ought to behave. But in the earlier part of the 19th century, this had all been part of a social consensus, which in the large cities like New York and Philadelphia and Boston was breaking down. You had more and more people who would have been considered lower class or working class who were appearing in parts of town where they were not supposed to be in terms of social convention. I'm going to stop this and continue in the next video. See you then.